Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to another podcast of the Doctor's Lab with Dr. Khalid Green and myself, Dr. Abdul Haqq Baker. And looking today, I thought it'd be interesting, Khalid. You may be wondering, why did Abdul Haqq give this title, Text, Spies and Videotapes? I didn't want to use the original title of that movie, Sex, Spies and Sex, Lies and Videotapes.
Okay. I'm glad you didn't use that one. Yeah.
And then I think pointing to the more serious area and focus of the podcast, entrapment and prevent. And entrapment is something that you're familiar with and we've seen taking place mainly in the US. Okay. And then the prevent being the prevent strategy, whilst not as overt as the entrapment that we see in the West, in America, we see that prevent has moved along a particular slippery slope. Some would say it was there from the beginning. I would agree to an extent, but some of us became more disillusioned with it as time went along. But prevent has a lot to be desired. I'm talking of none other than the prevent strategy in the UK. It leaves a lot to be desired in the way that it's targeted Muslim communities. And would I say entrapment? We can discuss that, but it's definitely targeted and criminalized and marginalized the community. So I think we said we would discuss these various aspects, and I'll speak to particular elements of my PhD in that regard, inshallah.
Inshallah. Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Hayyakallah. Yeah, so that I'll be coming from a little bit of a different perspective, and I have quite a few I guess stories that hit home with quite a few individuals, and I'll try to refrain from naming individuals necessarily, but we've had quite a bit of activity here in Washington State, where I'm from, Seattle specifically. And it was actually because of these strategies of the, infiltration and the baiting and so forth. And unfortunately, the ideology, of course, that accompanies that was a large part of the reason for the demise of one of the only revert hubs that we had here in the Seattle history. I mean, we've had the Nation, of course, the Nation of Islam, and we've had other, but really a group that was trying to, with the religious zeal as much as possible, trying to practice Islam. It was completely destroyed after, that period of 9/11 and some of the activities that were going on there. Or maybe that was prior. In fact, that might have been prior to 9/11. I can't recall. But yeah, subhanAllah.
No, mashallah. I think when we look at prior to 9/11, as you and I are aware, we've spoken a few times about the dawah and how Dawah to Salafiyah was really surging and burgeoning in that call to Tawheed and the Sunnah and everything like this. And then some of the fissures started taking place, which we've discussed as well.
Yeah.
I think that no one, I wouldn't say that predicted 9/11, but not on the scale that it would come. But we were aware of the rhetoric that fueled the ideology, that fueled that particular extremism, that terrorism on that particular occasion. And I think that it was post that time now, Salafiyah became even more under the spotlight. I think the lens was shone very, very brightly on Salafiyah. And wa alaikum salam to all of those of you who have come in. It's good to see regulars there and new participants today. Welcome to all of you, mashallah. So for me, I think when we started seeing the government trying to get to grips with what was happening, and they were looking at that particular time for credible partners, because up until then you had the usual suspects, Muslim Brotherhood types, progressive, if you want, types, always speaking the loudest, saying that they were representative of the Muslim community. You even had at that time the Muslim MCB, in the UK, which
MCB.
was Muslim Council of Britain. Muslim Council of Britain,
Okay. Okay.
which was more politicized, some Muslim Brotherhood links, and they actually had the government, Tony Blair at the time, who was Prime Minister, actually paid attention to them up until that particular point. But then post 9/11, when criticism was leveled at him because they were accordingly politicized according to the Muslim Brotherhood, Ikhwani Muslimin ideology, then they started distancing themselves. However, there was a call for grassroots initiatives and to work with credible partners. So some of us, myself included, coming from our backgrounds where we were always at the brunt and being targeted by the police as black people, black youth, black young people in that instance there. We thought, okay, if they really want to know those who can deal with the issue and they're talking about partnership, meaning they're going to leave us to do what we have to do. Us understanding that they've got political procedure and policies, but to leave us with what we had to do and that we could get on with our own community. Get on in what way? Engaging. The work we were doing in the 90s, but more within an official realm. And that was acceptable as a strategy governmentally, which was good because we thought to ourselves, we're just going to continue with our work. Many communities, especially Salafi communities, that changed and morphed into where it's gone now, with Prevent being a community targeting initiative, not a community focused initiative. You've heard me use those two phrases, and I'll explain again. Targeting in that top down, looking at communities as suspects and under the lens of suspicion, a heavily securitized community focus or targeting, should I say. Whereas community focused was understanding to work from the grassroots, letting credible partners engage with their communities and leaving them to do that, understanding that they were covering the role well. And I mentioned that in my PhD studies. I've gone to the conclusion here, and I put a subsection in chapter 9, the need for a local counter-radicalization, bottom-up, grassroots approach. And I discussed that there in that instance. But I don't want to go back to that in too much detail because we're looking at where Prevent is now. And it changed in 2011 when the Conservatives came in with the Liberal Democrats as a coalition, and they reverted to that targeting communities in that instance. So I want to ask you, regarding the US, we hear about entrapment, we hear about people being set up, basically, and then falling prey to it. And I have a question in that instance there from the US perspective and the UK perspective. Is there a naivety among our communities, okay, where we fall or are susceptible to entrapment from that perspective there, being duped in that particular instance? And some might say I was naive, or my colleagues and I were naive to engage initially with the Prevent strategy in the early stage, believing that grassroots, bottom-up partnership facilitatory approach was going to work. And I would hear that criticism and say, okay, I hear what you're saying, but I'll come back and I'll put that caveat that we decided to do that because we had, for the entirety of our lives prior to embracing, being targeted. And we said, we're not going to let this happen anymore to the generation that's coming after us. We will become a bridge and a barrier at the same time between government and them, us taking care of our own without the lens of government upon them and us, because they're now accepting we need to leave those credible partners and those credible communities to deal with their own as they know how to. So hence, as I said, that I don't think was naive in that particular instance. Seeing where Prevent has gone now, some might say, well, didn't you see this coming? And there they might say, you were naive. And I will, as I said, I'd not accept that criticism, but I would engage with them, understanding why they've made such criticism.
Very, very interesting. So, and I agree with you very much. The strategy in America is very much community targeted, as you mentioned. You know, so whole communities, and this goes prior to really Muslims having that experience in America. For example, we had all the black movements, even the ones that were nonviolent, whether it was the Southern Coordination Committee, SNCC, and which Martin Luther King and other movements, to Malcolm X, the Nation of Islam, the Black Panther Party. Prior to them, we've had that has been America's way of dealing with whatever they feel is militant, basically going against the norm and so forth. So they target them, and especially as minorities, whether that was Latinx communities, as they refer to, the Hispanic movements and so forth, and the Native American movements. Many leaders have been assassinated, set up. This has been a common strategy. So when Islam became more politicized and more focused on the world stage, after 9/11 and prior to 9/11 with Sheikh Omar Abdurrahman,
right?
In New York with the World Trade Center, and various other incidents or potential incidents, Muslims had began to raise up their cause the intelligence services and so forth to raise their brow and to scrutinize the Muslims and to be but definitely September 11th changed the whole game. What I wanted to mention along with that, before we get into some of the techniques and so forth that they've applied throughout American history, really, I think it's important to kind of revisit one of the criterion or one of the definitions. For example, this is something I got from Rand, and it was various authors writing this, and they mentioned about, so this is revisiting what we talked about prior, the definition of terrorism and so forth. So they define terrorism as an intentional act of violence or something of violence, let's see, or threat of violence, by a non-state actor that meets 2 or 3 of the following criterion. First, the act was aimed at attaining a political, economic, religious, or social goal. So, of course, that includes these the white nationalists and the rise of those and anti-government militias and so forth. Secondly, an act included, an act of violence or what have you, included evidence of an intention to coerce, intimidate, or convey some other message to a larger audience or the immediate victims. Now that's very interesting, because obviously, when we think of the concept of terrorism, this is terror. It's to inflict fear. It's to inflict, to spread that fear. So sometimes those groups, they target, maybe it's whether the difference between targeting an individual or an individual or something to make a statement, to make a greater statement. And you're aware of this, but just for the sake of bringing us up to speed. Also, an act included evidence of an intention to coerce, intimidate, or convey some other message, a larger audience other than the immediate victims. Acts must be outside the context of legitimate warfare activities. And then they say that, so this is in the American context, and they exclude mental illness attacks. So this is why perhaps, they exclude a lot of these, as we know, in 1 year, America may have 350 mass shootings, yearly, annually, we're having, quite a few of these kind of attacks. And they are often, not classified as terrorism. They say, an active shooter, and it would really be a difference of the race or if the person was a Muslim. It would change the whole, as we saw with the Capitol attack and so forth, and what happened there. And so, and then the other criterion is if that is excluded from terrorism is if it is an ordinary hate crime. Okay, so so I guess that means if it's just an individual and whatever, you harass them or you do something to them, but it wasn't meant to necessarily spread around the community and cause fear in the community. So I just wanted to lay that foundation because it's very relevant to some of the things I'm going to speak to. So back to your question, you said about the naivety of the Muslim community in that regard, and I think what you're getting at is how I would answer that if I'm understanding your question properly, is that they're naive in two ways. One, as if just being silent and not taking any steps to prevent and address extremism in the communities.
That's right.
That's one aspect. Another aspect is a lot of the, I don't know if we should call them victims. Some of them are victims because they're victims of entrapment. So they are naive. And some brothers sent me some books, and I forwarded them to you. I didn't know about the authors, so I didn't. I skimmed through one, and one of the things they were saying, they're talking about the false flag in Paris, the false flag here, false flag there. I didn't read enough into, but I didn't like the style that it was written. One of them, it wasn't academic. He was using names, stupid people like this, it just didn't seem like, this is an academic writing this. So, but the point is, and so he was basically advancing the argument, which I agreed to a degree, that there's a lot of individuals who are very naive and they may be politically charged. So then basically you have the intelligence services, like in America, we have the FBI and we have Homeland Security, and we have them who feed them. They play on them, boom, entrap them, and game done. He's in the prison for 20 years or under the prison, or, things like this. So this is how I see the naivety in relation to what you said. And I'll turn it back over to you. Yeah.
And that's interesting that you've said that, because what that does is it brings back to mind for me the cognitive development framework that I produced in my PhD. And it's clear that entrapment is of individuals at the first two very rudimentary stages of the founding stage and the youthful stage, which are both idealistic, formative, if you like, and they don't target those at the adult, more mature phase who are seasoned, experienced Muslims in that particular instance. So then, looking at what you've said there, that then feeds into the formation of Street, and why I decided to do Street, my organization, because we were assisting and helping our target audience who were at those two stages, making them more resilient to these sort of traps and ploys and the rhetoric that they were given, but we were making them resilient, not to government and to be falling susceptible to government, but to making them resilient against the extremist narrative and the Takfiri propagandists, as it were. So this is very, very interesting that I'm hearing this from you, that it's clear that they were targeting individuals at that, because they won't target you and me, for example. Yeah.
One thing I want to interject with, so our audience, because I know we're on the same page because we've talked about this many times, is that model that you have is a model, and that no doubt there's a lot that are exceptions, or what I would say, because I'm thinking specific individuals that I know here in Seattle, that were set up. And, they don't fit perfectly in that scale. Some of them, they're in their 40s or what have you. They maybe embrace prison, Islam in the prison system or what have you. So, there's just so many variables there. But no doubt there's I would say there is extreme relevance for your model. I'm not just undermining that. What I'm saying is that, as what I see, is that deals with a large section, because then there's those that are maybe ideologically hardcore, which I think I know you agree. We've talked about this, and I don't know how that fits in the model, but I would just say people are just always in maybe in flux, or it's never so black and white. There's people who are maybe on the cusp and so forth. Go ahead.
But
Turn it
to
back.
elaborate on my cognitive model, and I think you're absolutely right to highlight this. You can be in your 40s and experienced with life, okay?
Yeah.
But you can be ideologically at the founding youthful stage. If you embraced Islam in prison, for example, okay? Because even though you've embraced it in prison, you still have to go through a process of learning. However, your life experiences may place you further along that model. You might be at the adult mature phase because of your life experiences, because of your even academic knowledge in that instance, your career. But religiously, you're at that very early stage. And then it can be the other way around. Someone can be at the latter stages, adult or mature phase, with regards to their deen, okay? But with their socioeconomic position or their academic position, they could be at the very rudimentary stage. So there are two parallels that are always in flux or more on that cognitive model. And I've encapsulated that. When I was implementing it on street, we had some individuals who were maybe at the adult stage of their lives and life experience, but they were very basic in their knowledge and understanding of Islam. So they were susceptible to a violently politicized message in that particular instance. But again, it's still interesting that model can fit in various areas, from a structural perspective, societally, how they're targeted in your environment, and how it can affect and help the younger target audience in a UK perspective. And what's key here is that moving to another framework of mine, I developed the funnel theory, and I gave a traverse perspective and a two-dimensional perspective in that instance. And I think that what you'll see, and I'm asking this question to you as well, looking at that model, as you know, you've got the liberal element where a lot of the Muslims are. Then the gravitational pull downwards moves you to more conservative communities that are more insular. Okay, they're not on in that the whole liberal sphere of society. And as you go down, the gravitational pull towards radicalization gets stronger and stronger, with these individuals disappearing from the folds of society, and we see them eventually violently radicalized. But as they're going down that gravitational pull of the funnel, you'll find communities that, whilst insular and not extreme, understand the problem, like Salafi communities, and they're at the actual neck of the funnel, where there's the intense pulling, and they've been able to cause a reflux when they've combated and countered that that radicalization and that drive for radicalization. So my question is this: in your society, it would seem to me that entrapment would take place of those who are moving down gravitationally in that funnel. They're actually moving downward, and the authorities are seeing that by way of their more radicalized speech, their activity online. Whereas with Salafis, that doesn't take place. With Salafis, there's a constant. They're just there, combating, refuting. They're not going down. There's no gravitational pull. They're not even going up in the sense of liberalism. So when Salafis are targeted as being extreme, okay, you have to ask, is this part of the government strategy, which I believe it is, to marginalize a very effective and successful element of the Muslim community who are at that most crucial stage of combating extremism, and just putting them all in the same basket as extremists in order to facilitate those that are being pulled down gravitationally, to entrap them or to throw them off guard, and to target their ideology and criminalize it societally, as we've seen taking place with Salafi communities in the West?
Big, powerful question. So in-depth question. What I would say is at least what I have seen, and again, I've been in Saudi Arabia for so long, so I haven't been in America on the ground, but it seems to me that Salafi communities generally have not been targeted per se, meaning because they're not the ones sending their youth to go to Somalia and, join Shabab or, ISIS supporters. Those things are squashed before those movements took place. It's Salafis inherently are always vetting those ideologies. So even before some of those groups arise, Salafis are already, because of being so critical for the good and the bad, when people go too far and they have elements of extremism or what have you. But the bottom line is it's a critical community. They criticize each other. Unfortunately, we see a lot of the infighting, and I'm not saying that's inherent to Salafia, but unfortunately, it's kind of been taking place in the Western context and around the world. It's taking place. So I would say they're not targeted per se as much because I think the intelligence services, through their surveillance and stuff, they know a lot about those other communities. Now, they will still try to obviously discredit and so forth, but I know that they're very aware. And I'll give you I came back from, I'll give you an example. I came back from Saudi Arabia one summer, and this was with one of the major guys who I would say kind of put Seattle on the map with Homeland Security and so forth. And first, I heard it on NPR, National Public Radio, which I'm a big listener when I come back to America. So I was listening, and all of a sudden they said, they mentioned his name, like the so-and-so such and such case who has 100% cooperation with the government. And I was like, wow, because me and this guy, he was a student of Abu Hamza. He reverted to Islam here in Seattle, went to the UK, studied with Faisal. Faisal wasn't hardcore enough. Then got with Abu Hamza. Abu Hamza, I maybe sent him to Afghanistan, and then he was going to sell laptops to the Taliban. This is one of the cases charges against him. He just got, his whole life. I mean, they did some things to him. So the bottom line is they knew what to look for. And as you said, you mentioned it perfectly. As you were mentioning, I was like, man, I was going to read something from this RAND report. Anyway, the national, National Security something, or NSI anyway, in America, they have a policy, or had a policy called see something, say something. See something, say something. So this is about a campaign in order to root out potential terrorists. And so one of some of the things they would, under their campaign, some of the things that were reported to them were, as far as being suspicious activity, were if they saw, they looked at potential targets of site surveillance, extremist rants, as you mentioned, so that would be on the internet now and social media, especially if someone's putting Facebook posts and they're praising Abu Bakr Baghdadi, or, these kind of things, smuggling-like behavior of would-be terrorists trying to get through transit points, discoveries of suspicious documents such as target site surveillance write-ups or boxes of fake government ID cards, paramilitary training. That was a big thing when people were just paintballing. People were having problems, many communities in the past. Yeah. And some were probably legitimately, in that time, were actually trying to, I'm sure in some minority cases, there were those who were actually taking it serious as that they were training to go overseas or to carry out attacks. But the point is the way they framed it. Suspicious purchase of weapons, poisons, explosive, several cases, and threatening authorities and so forth and so forth. So those things are well known. So the point being is they have a campaign, they've had a campaign and still have a campaign, and this is how they target a lot of individuals. And when I think of, I can think of several individuals, one who was off the radar, who we didn't know. He was very close to us, and we had no idea what was going in this man's head, but you could see signs that he had withdrawn. I did see that, the last contact I had with him, he was asking me a lot of questions about hijrah and seeking knowledge. So I thought this was a good thing. I was like, man, all right. And I said, but make sure you take care of your family, do it responsibly, blah, blah. I was giving him advice. And next thing you know, I hear that he has killed several people and is wanted between states. And then when they finally brought him to court, he said, I just wanted to do my part, meaning do my part against disbelievers for what they're doing in Iraq and Afghanistan and so forth. So he actually just took it to the street and literally set up, people. And so that was one scenario. I know another individual. He started a YouTube channel and he was asking me, and he was like, hey, let's do a collaboration. I said, Haqq, you should really study. Don't just go out and just start talking about Islam. Be patient, okay? So he has this YouTube channel, and I just went to check it, just to look anyway and see what is he talking about. He shouldn't be on there. I know he hasn't studied. He's just eager. And sure enough, it's all these political rants and this, and he's fired up. And he was a brother in that mature phase, and he's the one I was thinking of, come out of the prison and so forth. But he was, a family man. He was he was trying to do his thing. But even I would invite him. I said, hey, let's sit down. I will go through some books with you. I'll teach. And he's like, no, I don't have time for that. I'm whatever. And the bottom line is, so they're that ideology. These individuals, as you mentioned, they're probably maybe there wasn't the maturity as far as their understanding in Islamic knowledge,
right?
So that they're still shopping, and these ideologies, this ideology of make and move, this appeals to them. I mean, this is very. I know in the Afro-Caribbean community there in the UK or what have you, and definitely African American community, we have a community of revolution, especially African Americans, right, from slavery up until now. Even the churches were often members and places of revolution. The Nation of Islam, groups after group after group. So we have this as a whole history. Some of us have Black Panther Party heads that were uncles and grandfathers, and some people actually come out of those movements, come out of the nation. You go to Philly and those places, brothers have, whole communities came out of the Nation of Islam, or, ex-Black Panther Party, ex this, has body count. Body count means he's killed many people, in Jahiliyyah, but now he's an upright Muslim, alhamdulillah. Ni'ma to Islam. So the point is we have a, it's inherent in the community, that revolutionary zeal to a degree, that if you're not just talking about something and you're not doing something, man, we don't want to hear you. So with that being the case, that makes people who are ignorant of their religion, who are in that immature phase, they're more susceptible to entrapment. They're already kind of talking, they're ranting, they're putting it on social media. The FBI is sitting there, we got another one, let's work on him. Hey, brother, I just saw your post. I'm a brother from such and such place. Man, I'd love to meet with you, man. We really got to do something. Then it starts, they build the relationship. Next thing you know, and this particular brother, they had him, I couldn't believe it. He was going to go out to the army base out in Tacoma, is what they allege. And they were going to supply him. They did supply him with weapons that were duds. They actually supplied him. So you're like, what in the world? The community was shocked. But this is how it works. So I'd say there's an element of that naivety, and which makes people susceptible to that, and the ideology and the immature phase and the ignorance. How many youth? We have a lot of young Somali youth, 18, 19. The intelligence service, they get his zeal, and they work on him. Next thing you know, he's going to prison for however many years for conspiracy to support a terrorist group, or to go to Shabab, or they do go there and then they die, or whatever the case may be. So it's a big problem, and a lot of it is that naivety, which makes them susceptible to those intelligent forces. And that's why I say Salafis, generally speaking, we can't say are totally immune, but we have very few cases, usually people that are really knowledge-based Salafis going to that, moving from that to joining those extremists. Right. Although we have some cases, but most of those guys were not knowledge. When you look at them, and if you know some of these individuals, Morton Storm, I think we talked about, he left Islam eventually, but he was once, you know, even Sheikh Muqbil, rahmatullah alayhi, used to, you know, like him and know his name. And, you know, and I remember sitting with the Sheikh, and Morton had an eagle, a baby eagle. And he was asking the Sheikh, he's saying, Sheikh, what should we do? Because it was a special bird that's mentioned in the hadith that you should kill. And the Sheikh said, kill him. And he was sad. And then they, you know, they cut the poor little eagle's head off, or whatever kind of bird it was. But the point being is that is that, you know, you don't usually see grounded individuals, people who have actually, you know, stabilized in knowledge or stabilized in the dawah doing that. Now, there's
you've elaborated very well, which confirms my cognitive framework in that you mentioned this elder individual who was at the mature stage with regards to life experiences, but he hadn't studied, didn't have knowledge or anything. So that placed him at the very beginning of the cognitive framework of the founding stage, or at most the youthful, overzealous, idealistic phase, where understandings are abstract. But his understanding of life, because of his life skills, were contextualized. They were not abstract because of the life experiences that he had. He had an actualization on a different level. So that happens. That happens. And again, it's interesting. I think we're discussing this because the viewer should see from the US perspective that those individuals are targeted when they see that, yes, mature in life, prison, or maybe just not even prison, just mature in age, but rudimentary knowledge Islamically. And this again happens with those who were Salafi, who had all the vigor and the zeal because they saw the Salafi movement and how it was and how it continues to be in some instances, but they hadn't grasped the foundations of knowledge as they should have done, and they were at that very susceptible stage, which was not sufficient in itself to say they were grounded Salafis, because grounded Salafis do not go to extremism in that particular way. But what this brings me to, and I think there needs to be some, I want to do some inward reflection at this point now and ask you, because one of the things that Salafis were criticized for, and I'm including myself and Street and Brixton community and from Salafis generally, is that because of what you've said concerning that revolutionary streak that is inherent in us, not just African Americans, but African Caribbeans, Afropeans, as I call myself, because of what we are having to withstand of systemic racism in the West. And it affects us more than it affects anyone else. The South Asians cannot step up and say, in that instance there, the Somalis cannot even come and say that they've endured that. We've endured it, and our forefathers have endured this for centuries. We're talking from slavery. So my question is now, the point that I'm looking at now is, with us as Salafis, when we looked at that need to counter extremism and terrorism from a Western perspective, and our countering suddenly found resonance with wider society, with government agencies, because they were aligned. So initially, from a UK perspective, coming back to Prevent, they then came and said, we understand grassroots, continue your work. We want to work in partnership with you because you understand. And what was good is they even started respecting the ulama that we were going to, because the ulama started speaking, and some traveled and they did conferences and workshops teaching government security officials about what the Sunnah was, how Salafiyah was not of extremism, and those who called themselves Salafis and then had the ideology of Dal Harb and everything like this were not Salafis in that instance, explaining that we had a successful phase in the West. And I know that what I'm seeing from like the colleagues that I know from the TAM group who I work with and everything, that there's more transparency or openness with Salafis in a US perspective. But this is the point that I'm looking at now. Have we been, as Salafis, and non-Salafis may be surprised I'm saying this, have we been naive collectively because of the advice we've taken from our ulama from Muslim countries, who are often with the governments they work for, understandably so, combating extremism from a societal perspective in those Muslim countries, and therefore the advice that's extended from those scholars to us in the West is almost as though it's within the same paradigm that, yeah, there's no problem not to work for the government, but if they're understanding the Salafi dawah, to work in parallel or in partnership with them, because you are the most effective at doing that. Now, was there a naivety with us from the advice that we took in that instance? Was it correct to take that advice, knowing that their context is a complete Muslim context dealing with Muslims, and the nuances there in such a society are different to the nuances in a Western non-Muslim society? And I'm asking that now as I'm thinking about it, because I'm not saying it's right one way or the other, but I need to bring that parallel, because some of us, alhamdulillah, not myself, were taking it whole hog, as they say. Like, okay, take everything that's come from the ulama and apply it as though we're in the same societal context as they are. And that was incorrect, because we know that non-Muslim governments, that while they may come part of the way to work with yourselves, they do still have a lens that they're looking at you with suspicion, and to ensure that your ideology, your methodology, your call is thwarted or muted to some extent. So do we know that and say, do you know what, but we're still going to be able to do our dawah and do what we need to do? So we know that, we know what the governments are like. They've opened up a space here. Let's move into that space. Or do we do what others have done? It's like, no, don't trust them at all. Stay back, marginalize, have tacit approval by keeping silent when we see acts of extremism, as some Muslim entities and think tanks and groups have done. Or do we go to the other extreme of the progressives in that particular instance? For me, I think we remained in the middle. But I think that the advice that we took on board and placed in the context of our societies could have been a little bit more tailored, so that some entities of the Salafis moved too close to government, too close. Some of us kept a distance, like Street, but we worked in parallel to an extent when we saw it was going south, it was going in the wrong direction. Others went too close, too deep, which has affected them and individuals who were part of that to a greater extent. So it's a deep question I'm asking. I hope you understand the nuances I'm saying.
I think so.
And do we continue to do that today? When we're getting fatwa from our scholars within a Western context, are we tailoring that, taking out the bits that are relevant and saying to the sheikhs, we can't use that, we can't go with that? Because then we get accused of being like government scholars, we get accused of being spies. And I want to talk upon this thing of spies now, and I'm going to stop on this particular point. We know the ayat in Surah Hujurat. All the Muslims know the ayat in Surah Al-Hujurat. I don't know any circumstance or context, and I've never heard any scholar in my 30 years plus of being a Muslim saying that that ayat, that verse, do not spy on each other, goes out of the window in any time or any shape or any form for any Muslim. So I want to make this very clear, because you've got those detractors from Salafiyah saying they spied, they were informing to the police and everything like that. And I can say categorically from myself, the community, everything, that never, ever, ever happened. And that's what caused us problems with government, because they saw they won't do that. They were only working for their community in that particular instance. That's the one. And I'd say, despite statements that were heard on the news, taken out of context, not given their full context and understanding, I'm referring to that as well. So that's about spying. But then I'm going to say this and pass it back to you. But you do see, on the other hand, those extremist protagonists who were accusing Salafis of this, and I will mention names, Abu Hamza al-Misri. We see him on trial
Faisal.
In your country. No, Abu Hamza particularly, on trial in your country, producing hundreds of pages showing that he'd worked for years with the police, in agreement with the police. And I know from the solicitors that I worked with, finances were exchanged in that instance as well. So those who were calling others informers, spies, and everything like that were actually doing it themselves. And they revealed it from themselves when they were about to be incarcerated and facing trial in US prisons. So when individuals, this informer, spy, everything like that, I'm very cautious when I hear others throwing that out against Salafis. Because I've only mentioned him. I can mention others who, when on trial, bore evidence that they were given money by police to go into Syria. They were given money to do certain things just to try and escape going to prison. And these are extremist protagonists.
Yeah, of course.
So coming back to that point, that taking of advice from the scholars and placing it in a Western context without any tailoring or without any nuance, I believe that has harmed Salafis in that instance and shown a naivety so far as it comes to application.
Well, first I would say that as a fiqh principle, the scholars mention, and this is about giving fatawas and so forth as well, hukm ala shay far'an ala tasawwurihi, which means that part of making a ruling on something is that you have a correct information about it, correct background. So, for example, I can't say, hey, there's a guy in America, Sheikh, and he's like this, and I give a couple of traits of him so I can get him to make tabdi of this individual. You know, I have to give, if I'm truthful and honest, I need to give a correct picture of the issue.
Right.
So this comes down to what is being conveyed to the ulama, and then also who are the ulama that are being asked these questions and what they are, are they following that? Are they just taking a couple of issues and boom, or are they getting a good tasawwur? They're getting a good background information about the issue that they're making a fatwa about. So for me, I think regarding this issue, that there's possibly some differences also with the American and the British context as well. Okay. So your experience, I think, may be the window of the UK, what you've seen on the ground and so forth. But what I would say in the fatwa that I've read about these kind of issues and even questions that I've asked Mashayikh and put it out there as well, that it's been consistent and, it's been very relevant. And I think with the context now, a fatwa, you're going to, it's going to have a limit in its scope. Okay. Yeah. Sheikh's not going to say, oh yeah, work with them or don't work with them. It's not going to be black and white. It's going to be about whatever the issue is and hopefully bring the nuances. That's up to the questioner should be giving those nuances if that's what they're trying to elicit as an answer. Okay. To get, to have a good understanding of the issue. So for me, I definitely don't fault the ulama in that sense. And I believe those fatwa are relevant in some of the things that I've seen, because they've, some of the, in the American context, some of the fatwa and things that I've seen translated and people mentioning, asking Sheikh if, we know there's a extremist in the masjid or something, can we tell the police that this guy's about to do an attack or he's going to cause danger to the community or whatever? And the Sheikh says, yes, of course. This is, from different masail in the deen, you'll mention fiqh principles and other principles, from commanding the good, forbidding the evil, protecting yourself from the harms, looking at the masalih and the mafasid, the harms and the benefits. So they're looking at those issues. So that's what I've seen in general. Now, as far as people going in and being, I haven't seen any mashayikh writing off on that or know of any situations of Salafis doing that. So I don't see that being an issue, but I think the issue more so is obviously we need that scholarship on the ground here because we have daily issues of how to engage as Muslim minorities. This is just somewhat new ground. This is new territory. The reality of what we're living of Muslim minority communities in France, in the UK, in Belgium, in Luxembourg, in America, in this place and that place, we're dealing with somewhat new issues. So there's a whole series of issues. And in the context of each of those societies, it's not a black and white answer. You can't say us in the West, we have this sheikh. And a lot of times I used to ask questions like this, but in reality, when you think about, you know, and you gain more knowledge about what's going on in some of these countries, you see that there's different approaches. You know, there's different approaches of the intelligence. There's different approaches of, as we know, in the French case, of the secularism and the onslaught of secularism. We don't have that in America. In America, you can practice a lot of your deen in that sense, and you don't have those same inhibitions and the force to assimilate and so forth.
Right.
So each society has its own context and its own nuances, and those things have to be brought to the ulama, because these are major issues. Now, on the ground, those people of knowledge from amongst us, you know, our mashayikh and stuff, of course, they have to deal with that. They are the ones who should be more, you know, for example, the issue of voting or not to voting, to look, you know, for the sake of the lesser of the evils, a khaf ad-dararain. You know, is it better to, instead of being silent, you know, staying out of that atmosphere, should we have voted for Biden because he's going to be a less evil for us as Muslims? You know, there's going to be less gun-toting, you know, once the dust settles, hopefully, than under the Trump era. So, you know, all of those are major messiah, and they require knowledge. But I don't think there's any failure on the part of our ulama at all, and I don't see any fault there. I think it's, you know, again, those things have to be contextualized, and I can speak a little bit about what I've read in the American experience, and I've only read things about the UK experience and from your experience and so forth. So I think Salafis in general know not to, but, you know, there are some ignorant ones who may go real deep like that, as you mentioned.
So no, what you said, Jazakallah khair for that clarification, because you're right. I'm not casting aspersions in its entirety to the ulama. I do believe that some of our scholars, in some of the advice that has been given, and the nature of the advice that has been given, there hasn't been an understanding or maybe an explanation to those scholars of the context of some of those societies. So therefore, what has come from them and what has been implemented has been more damaging, in particular instance, not only on a wider societal basis, but particularly amongst Muslim communities in that instance as well. So I agree on the whole with what you're saying in that particular instance, and it's down to the Salafi communities, those Salafi entities, in how they've taken forward what they've got. Okay, and even close to home, some of my former colleagues and some of the things that they said that they had instructions to do from scholars, which was recorded and then used against the community, and it was actually wrong what was being said, that scholars have said you can spy if you suspect someone. That was never said by the scholar that the individual said that it came by, because the scholar wouldn't say that concerning Muslims in that particular instance because of the prohibition of spying. What I would say though is, and concluding on that point, it's down to the questioner, and it's down to how they apply that knowledge when they're actually coming back, and how deep they go. And because we don't really have very strong caucuses as Salafis in particular, and I don't think the Muslim caucus or the Muslim pressure groups are as strong as they could be, there is that difficulty on not saying no, but having your parameters and boundaries clear. And alhamdulillah, one of the things, I'm not going to blow my own trumpet, the colleagues of those who worked with me in street and everything, we were very clear. And when we saw things getting tricky, and I've done a 2-part podcast on Prevent and inside out of Prevent, and I gave documentation, everything like that, because we weren't just working alongside government. We had a lot of NGOs who came to us separately, who we were working with, who said, we've got a cohort of youth, we see your work. We had youth probation services coming out saying they only want Muslims to engage with them. And so we were there and everything. Those things aren't spoken about. I think many of the other entities that engage with Prevent later on work directly and only with government, where that wasn't the thing they should have been doing. They should have been working with these NGOs who had Muslim target audiences, who needed that help, who needed that empowerment, but also they needed to be firm enough. And I remember I said this when I was on an interview, and Aaron Kundani, I think it is, or Kundani, wrote a book, The Muslims Are Coming. And it was a critical review of the Prevent, and rightly so. It was quite a timely book. And I was on an interview with him, and I mentioned in that interview with the host of the show, that Muslim communities needed to be robust enough to define their parameters and draw their lines with government, even though it's a David and Goliath particular instance. And I think coming from the background that we come from and the resilience that we had to have, we were always bucking the trend and kicking back against the society, the structure, the police and everything. So to say these are our parameters and we're not going amongst them, we're not giving you any intel, we're not giving you any information. Our only criteria is, as you've said, what the scholars said, if you have certain knowledge, you know, ilm al-yaqeen, ayn al-yaqeen, haqq al-yaqeen, all the 3 levels of yaqeen, that someone is going to enact a terrorist atrocity, then as not just because you're Muslim, but as a citizen, it's your duty to do that. Alhamdulillah, we never had anyone come through us in that particular instance there. So all we would continue to do is prepare the young target audience to make them more resilient against the message of extremism in that instance, and protect them from the securitized lens of government. That's what we did in that instance. And it started causing problems because of the robustness of our infrastructure, and because we wouldn't play ball and accede to the shifting sands of government requests to change from that grassroots bottom-up partnership initiative, and they flipped it in 2011 that it will become hierarchical, top-down, seeking informant elements, like we saw with the progressives, Quilliam and everything, saying now let's target these communities and treat them as suspect communities, to the extent that Prevent is now snatching children out of schools and family homes because they suspect that they're extreme in that particular instance. And that's very important, to have that resilience. And would I say these individual entities who are so-called experts and everything now, who are so-called former extremists, who are still working and pandering to government, should they be working with them under the current Prevent thing? The current Prevent 2, Mark 2, as we've called it, is toxic. It doesn't need to be revised. It just needs to be dismantled, because that is a targeting framework now. Unlike when we initially engaged with it in 2005, and it wasn't that, and that it was understood not to be that. So while it's not entrapment, it is a targeting tool to marginalize and criminalize elements of the Muslim community. And because of the progressives who said, basically, first they talked about Islamism, which in and of itself isn't a clearly defined term, so you can loosely target Muslim Brotherhood and other individuals, and those who are politicized, but not Muslim Brotherhood, but those who are politicized and are affected by what's going on in the Muslim world, which we all are in that instance. Then they targeted Salafi communities, and they did one thing further than they did with Islamists. They said that Salafis and extremists are one in the same. Look at Daesh, look at Abu Qatada, look at Osama bin Laden. And while they may have called themselves Salafis, you and I know by their ideological delineation away from the Aqidah to Salaf, that took them out of being Salafis. In the same way, when I was a Roman Catholic, if I took up particular doctrines of Church of England or Baptists, I would no longer be a Roman Catholic. I'd be one of those denominations. But somehow it's not understood willfully, I believe, when it comes to the delineations amongst the Muslims and these finer but very poignant details that exit one from Salafiyah or enters one into Salafiyah in that particular instance. So I think this has been fascinating. I didn't know that I was going to get from you those insights from the perspective of entrapment and be able to apply my framework, listening to what you're saying, to where the security targets individuals and how they target them, mashallah, and how that same framework is applied differently in a UK perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Contextualization is very important. Yeah, we see that.
It is.
Yeah. And as you said from the very start, you mentioned the difference between community engagement versus a community targeting, and that is generally the American strategy, you know. And when I was reading your research and I quoted from it for my research, that was one of the things that I mentioned in my in conclusion of my research, that perhaps America needs to look at a more and more of a community engagement strategy if they want to be more effective in what they're trying to do, and to not target the people who are effective at that, effective at combating that extremist ideology. And it's a very sensitive, obviously a sensitive area, and a very sensitive way of engagement, period, because of the resistance from the Muslims, and to understand where is that balance, how can we do that, especially those from the youth, and especially I would even say Salafi youth and others, on how to pull that off. It's a very sensitive area, and they realize this too. They, as I quoted from extensively from a paper that mentioned, and all of these Western academics, including Yasser Qadhi, they were all saying more or less the same thing, that, hey, Salafis are the most effective at combating this extremist ideology, but a lot of them had reservations as using Salafis as any kind of partners. They said they're too extreme socially, and we talked about this in our earlier podcast. They're too, they're too harsh. They're too, harsh in, as far as not being liberal. They're too conservative. They're not liberal enough. They're not going to, tolerate homosexuality. They're not going to do this and that and the other. And they're not democratic, and not democratic enough, and what have you. So, and not progressive enough, a movement. So this is, which another reason why it's very difficult. But however, at best, they can at least leave us alone, leave us alone.
Right.
And if we have the means to, again, as a final note, we need community building and community engagement in the societies that we live in. We need to know where those boundaries are. And again, this is a new area for us all, I believe. And, we require scholarship in that, so that way we're not just assimilating and throwing away our religion as the progressives tend to do, nor are we just sitting in a pocket that's not sustainable as well. We need to know to what extent we can engage and those dawabit, those criterion, and that will make us more effective and more fruitful as a community. So I'll end with that.
No, Jazakallah khair. And I'll end. I'm going to read the final paragraph of my PhD, actually, which spoke to some of this here. And I mentioned here, continuing governmental support for such groups and or personalities, this is the progressives I was talking about, the liberal extremists, has already served to alienate Muslim communities even further. Such support risks, in the researcher's estimation, my estimation, exacerbating the pendulum swing effect among Muslim youth from a more mainstream understanding of Islam towards a politicized and violent extremist interpretation. This is by the government supporting the progressives. This is by them targeting communities. Additionally, an unwitting or indeed deliberate bias to support such narratives may lead to increased conflation of socially conservative but mainstream revivalist groups with extremism. So basically, that's what's happened to Salafis, conflating us with extremist groups. This would compound the status quo and detract from existing evidence that continues to identify these very groups, the Salafi groups, as the most effective antidote to tackling violent extremism at the heart of where it currently proliferates, the grassroots. So just as the research that you've said, I'm concluding and concurring with that research that you have mentioned, in which Yasser Qadhi has commented as well, that the most effective, those at the neck of my theoretical funnel framework, Salafi communities, by virtue of their ideology, methodology, continue to be the most effective at combating extremism. However, we need to be careful on how far we take the advice from the scholars that we go to in drawing ourselves closely to government entities that say they want to work alongside us, because in actuality, that ends up being them controlling the narrative if those entities are not strong or resilient enough or have a strong enough identity to pull back, which a number of our community members didn't have and still don't have. And the few that do end up being labeled extremists or non-violent extremists, like myself, like my organization, in that instance. And I suppose by default, I should feel that's a badge of honor, because it doesn't place me in that government-controlled informer perspective, which the extremists throw back at you. So by virtue of polarization from a liberal extreme and government sitting comfortably there, and polarization by the violent extremist extreme, the Takfiris being on that side, we actually sit slap bang in the middle of that spectrum, and we always want to be the ones who are actually wasat. So I think we conclude on that, if you like, Khalid, unless you want to add anything else, and we can conclude for another evening, inshallah.
Yeah. One last thing I just want to mention. I think that it's up to us as individuals to give that good picture for the scholars. So that's what I would just qualify with what you said, is that still not faulting the scholars at all, but it's about giving them those nuances. Sheikh, here's what happens if we do. We're in America. The government is like this. Their intent is like this. And if we do that, it's like this. So a lot of times you'll see with educated questions to the scholars, you'll see that engagement. You'll see that, and those are the kind of really good, juicy questions, because it shows the person is engaging. They're not just, it's not a black and white answer. It's not, they know the issue's not a black and white issue. So it's very important for us, those individuals who are asking the scholars about these types of major Messiah and major issues, that they need to give a correct, nuanced picture. So that's what I would end by saying.
I agree, but I'm going to have to kick back a little bit on that.
Then I'm going to kick back at you.
But there are errors made by some of our scholars in that.
Everyone makes errors, but
we see, for example, to almost a critical effect, and we don't, because it's not a Western context, we don't need to go into that. But we have what we saw in Libya, for example, and advice being given in Libya by one of our scholars, okay, and we saw what happened in actuality from that it ended up being a faction of those who were purporting to be Salafis, killing other Salafis, and I'll bring it frankly there. And when that still came back, it wasn't an issue that was rectified, redressed in that instance. So I'm saying that as a caveat to say, because this is where we come under criticism as well from non-Salafis, that there's almost yes, the flesh of the scholars is poison, and we respect our ulama. But where there are clear errors in that particular instance, and we know that they're out there, I think the mistake of us as Salafis is to say, no, and to sweep it under the carpet and call it something other than what it is. And that doesn't mean we have to jump on the boat or the bandwagon where we start chastising the scholars in that instance, but to merely acknowledge that, yeah, this was an error because of what we're seeing happening between two groups of the same ideology and internecine fighting that we see on a microcosmic scale amongst us and a macro scale amongst the Salafis. We obfuscate, we cover it over, we don't want to deal with it, when a mere acknowledgement is enough to show, yeah, we get what you're saying there. And then we remain silent in that particular instance after that acknowledgement. That is important if we are going to have resonance amongst the wider Muslim community, because we have Salafi elements amongst us, Khalid, as you know, who just don't care about the wider community. We may say we do, not saying you and I, but our behavior and our chastisement and our denigration and our isolationism and our haughtiness against everyone else except those who are within our small framework or caucus are to be damned, and they're off and they're astray or they're irrelevant in that particular instance. We need to pull back from that, and a number of Salafis are not within that very small circle. We are part of the wider Muslim Ummah. We have empathy with the wider Muslim Ummah, and when they are critical of us in particular instances, and we can see it, we shouldn't explain it away, or we should not ignore it, and we should not kick back at them if it's something that we acknowledge is a legitimate mistake, error, oversight, misjudgment from our ulama or from ourselves. We've got to come to that table, and not doing so marginalizes us even more. And
here's where I'm going to kick back.
This is for the next time.
I can't let you go on this. This is my kickback, and it's going to be super brief because I have to go, actually.
That's okay.
The Prophet ﷺ said, all the children of Adam commit sins or make mistakes, and the best of those are those who make repentance.
Right.
Firstly, we're not responsible for what our scholars say. That's not I'm in America. So what a particular sheikh, who I might respect, makes a fatwa about Libya, that's between him and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If he did it out of his ijtihad because he is an alim, if he did it from his ijtihad, he's rewarded with one reward.
Sahih.
And you know, and he made a mistake. And if he did it out of, you know, I mean, and if he was correct, he gets 2 rewards. Right. As far as, you know, Sheikh so-and-so said this about this place or that place, that's not my concern. And that is not really a part of the dawah, that we have to defend anything that we see that is incorrect. And regardless of even the judgment of whether that's correct or not, it doesn't, what does it have to do with you in your locality or me in America? Now, if it was in the American context and I'm on the ground and I see what's going on, okay, then even with that, I don't have to justify. I can say that was the sheikh. You need to ask the sheikh about that. And again, that particular fatwa in that sense is also a political thing. So now we're getting to the politics. Again, that's, you know, he's going to be responsible. That's, you know, so I don't even have to worry about defending when I hear non-Salafis or others who are critical, and this that doesn't fade me. I say, well, you need to ask the sheikh, or you need to go in. I said, you don't see my dawah. I'm not talking and propagating about the politics. I could say a lot of stuff about this or that and the other, but I don't, you know, because it's really not it's not the way of for dawah. It's not the, you know, the way for the ultimate of calling to Allah and His Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, calling from the Book of Allah to the Book of Allah and the Sunnah of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam illa sunnatin rasulillahi sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So this is how I would respond with that. But anyway, we can save some more juice for the next time. Jazakumullah khairan, Doctor. Allah yubarak.
Jazakallah khair.
I definitely have to get right out the door because I got to get to Jumwa, which is in another city very far away.
I'll let you get ready to go on that, and I hope the audience have found this engaging and they've found some benefit in it, inshallah. And until another 2 weeks, inshallah, we'll see you then. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.